She was a quiet nurse with a sick child and a shattered past. He was the powerful CEO who unknowingly held her heart and her secret. When a single moment reignites everything they lost, dark truths unravel: a stolen pregnancy, a murdered mother, a child hidden for years. What happens when love, betrayal, and redemption collide under hospital lights? This is Elena's story. Raw, heartbreaking, unforgettable. Where are you watching from? If this story pulls at your heart, subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with us. The next chapter might just be the one that changes everything. It was nearing midnight at Silver Lake Medical Center in Portland. The kind of night where the fluorescent lights hummed just loud enough to unsettle, and the hallways stretched out like tunnels of quiet dread. Elena Moore moved through them like a ghost. Soft steps, head down, her navy scrubs brushing silently against her legs. At 28, Elena had mastered the art of invisibility. She kept her honey-brown eyes hidden behind thick glasses, and her once sunlit blonde hair was now a muted shade of mahogany, pulled into a tight, forgettable bun. Years of exhaustion had etched themselves into her bones, but she carried herself with a quiet, almost stubborn grace. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She was reliable. That was enough. Tonight, however, was different. An unexpected message had come through from the administrative office. The new CO needed a quarterly outcomes report delivered to his office, personally. Elena had blinked at the request, unsure why she, of all people, had been chosen. She wasn't in administration. She wasn't even a senior nurse. Maybe because she stayed late, maybe because she never said no. Either way, her stomach churned as she clutched the manila folder like a life preserver, her palms slick with sweat. She hated authority. Men in expensive suits and commanding voices always brought back memories she'd buried deep. The last time she'd been that close to someone in power. It had cost her everything. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt like an eternity. With every ding, her nerves rattled harder. This was a floor she had never seen before, only heard of in whispers. The executive wing, where the walls were made of polished wood, and the scent of antiseptic gave way to leather and cologne. When the doors slid open, she hesitated before stepping out. The air was cooler here, heavier somehow. A sleek, empty reception desk sat under a glowing wall sconce, and silence hummed in the background like a warning. She glanced at the nameplate etched in steel. Julian West, CEO. So, that was his name. Elena hesitated, her heart racing, then moved down the hallway, her sneakers making faint squeaks on the marble tile. She reached the office door and raised her hand to knock lightly. Once, twice. The sound was barely audible. No answer. She bit her lip, looking down at the folder. This was important. Critical data for the board meeting tomorrow. She couldn't just leave it on the floor, not with her name on it. Her practical nurse's brain kicked in. Maybe he'd left the water running, that noise. Yes, it was there now. A faint, rushing sound, like a faucet left open. Elena swallowed hard and turned the handle. The office was dim, lit only by a desk lamp casting golden shadows across a mahogany desk, leather chair, and closed laptop. The space was sleek, modern, and too quiet, but the water sound grew louder. Her eyes flicked to a door on the right, slightly ajar. Steam curled from the crack. She knew she shouldn't, but her hand moved anyway. She pushed the door open gently, expecting to find a sink, a burst pipe, something ordinary. What she found instead made her breath vanish. A man stood under the cascading stream of a glass-walled shower, the overhead light casting a soft glow over his shoulders. The water streamed down his muscular back, his dark hair slicked to his head. His eyes were closed. He hadn't heard her. Elena froze. Every nerve in her body seized. It wasn't just the sight of him. It was the recognition. Her knees wobbled. She staggered back, gasping, and the folder slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a sharp thud. That was enough. His eyes snapped open. He turned swiftly, eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice deep and startling. Elena couldn't speak. Her throat closed. Her legs acted before her brain did, spinning her around in a blur. She bolted from the room, the door slamming shut behind her. In the stairwell, she pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard, glasses fogging as sweat and shame flushed her cheeks. Julian West. She hadn't said his name in 6 years. And he hadn't recognized her. At least, not yet. Elena clutched the stair rail, her breaths coming fast and shallow, each one clouding her glasses. Her heart pounded so hard it echoed in her ears. What had she just done? She'd walked straight into the shower of the new CEO. Not only that, she'd dropped confidential paperwork at his feet and bolted like a terrified intern. God, she'd be fired. Worse, sued. Humiliated. The thought made her skin crawl. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rail tighter, the polished steel cool against her damp palm. She slid down to sit on the step, burying her face in her hands. But no matter how hard she squeezed her eyes shut, the image stayed burned behind her lids. Julian West. She hadn't said his name in years. 6 years ago, he was just Julian, a third-year med student with ink stains on his fingers and a grin that could melt through any bad day. Back then, she'd been a nursing student pulling double shifts at a nursing home, trying to stay afloat while her mother was in and out of surgeries. They'd met in a quiet corner of the hospital library. An accidental collision of books, pens, and mutual exhaustion. He had offered to carry her textbooks and stayed for her laughter, and for a moment it had felt like something real. Until the West family got involved. Until Margot West stepped in. Elena had grown up learning how to disappear in a crisis, but even she hadn't been prepared for the icy finality in Margot's voice that day. She still remembered the sterile white envelope, the check inside, the way her hand had trembled as she read the amount. She hadn't taken it for herself. She'd taken it for her mother, who was weeks away from a surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. The message was clear. Leave Julian, disappear, don't look back. And she had. She changed her phone number, moved across the city, took a different job, dyed her hair. A few weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. But it was already too late. She couldn't go back. Couldn't drag him into a war he didn't even know was being waged behind his back. Not when the cost of defiance was so high. Not when she'd already made a promise to protect the little life growing inside her. So she disappeared, and she survived. Barely. Now, after all those years, after everything, fate had marched her right back into his life. And not with a warning, not with a second chance. No, with a slapstick stumble into his private shower. Her cheeks flushed at the memory. The steam. The muscles. The voice she hadn't heard in half a decade. She stood up abruptly, heart still racing, and forced herself to walk. She couldn't stay hiding in the stairwell like a teenager. She made her way down, each step dragging her back into the fluorescent buzz of the lower floors. Her fingers itched to check her phone, to text Mason, to say something, anything, to get this panic out of her chest. But she didn't. She couldn't. Back at the nurse's station, the world had moved on as if nothing had happened. Monitors beeped, shoes squeaked. Someone laughed softly at a joke Elena didn't hear. She slipped into her chair, mind still spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling in her gut, a heavy knot of confusion, guilt, and something dangerously close to longing. In the office above, Julian West stood in a towel, staring down at the folder now spread open across his desk. The name written in quick, looping script caught his eye. Elena Moore. It tugged at something deep in his memory, like a song he used to hum in the shower, long forgotten. The name felt familiar, not just in passing, intimately. His brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. He didn't know this woman, did he? No, that was ridiculous. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. Her face, those wide, terrified eyes. There had been something there. A trace of a girl he'd once loved and lost to shadows. She looked different now, of course. Hair darker, glasses, a little thinner. But there was something in the way she ran. Like she knew what it was to lose everything. And somehow, that haunted him more than he expected. The morning after the incident unfolded like a slow unraveling. Elena arrived at the hospital early, slipping through the staff entrance with her head low and her badge already clipped to her chest. She moved with mechanical precision, checking charts, adjusting IVs, and greeting patients with a soft smile that barely reached her eyes. Inside, her mind was a storm. She replayed the moment in the shower on a loop, how her breath had caught, how his eyes had locked onto hers, how the air between them had changed in an instant. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was something heavier, something older. She told herself it didn't matter. He wouldn't remember her. She looked nothing like the girl he once knew. That girl was gone, buried under years of exhaustion, debt and silence. Still, every time she passed a reflective surface, she felt the ghost of him looking back. By midday, the hospital buzzed with whispers. A janitor had apparently seen her sprinting from the executive floor late last night, face flushed, hair unkempt. A group of nurses giggled near the break room, tossing around theories about the mysterious new CEO and the nurse who dared to enter his private domain. Elena kept her head down, her steps quick, but she could feel their eyes following her like spotlights. She wasn't made for gossip. She hated the way it clung to her skin like static. She had bigger things to worry about anyway, like Sophie. Her daughter had woken up with another unexplained bruise on her arm. Faint but undeniable. Elena's stomach had dropped when she saw it, and now the fear twisted through her like barbed wire. It wasn't the first time, and the pediatrician's vague reassurances were wearing thin. Something wasn't right, but she had no time to dwell. Her shift stretched ahead of her like a tunnel with no end. In his office upstairs, Julian stood at the window, the folder still on his desk. He hadn't slept much. He kept seeing her face, wide-eyed and fragile, her name echoing in his head like a forgotten verse. Elena Moore. It didn't make sense. But it tugged at him, insistent and familiar. He rubbed the back of his neck and finally pulled her personnel file. It was thin, graduated from a nursing program across town, employed at Silver Lake for almost 5 years, single mother, long shifts, no disciplinary records, quiet, dependable, invisible. But something about her refused to disappear. When he passed through the year later that day, his eyes scanned for her without thinking. And there she was, chart in hand, expression composed. A different Elena than the one in his memory, but no less captivating. She didn't look at him as he passed, didn't flinch, didn't react. That bothered him more than he expected. That evening, Elena found Mason waiting outside the hospital, leaning against his dented van with his usual crooked smile and a thermos of tea in hand. He handed it to her without a word. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Just took a sip and stared at the sky like it might give her an escape route. Mason nudged her shoulder. "Did he say anything?" She shook her head. "He doesn't know who I am." Mason hesitated. "And you want him to?" "No," she said too quickly. Then, softer, "I can't afford for him to." Mason didn't push. He never did. That was why she trusted him. He had stepped in when Sophie was born, filling in the blanks without question. People assumed he was Sophie's dad, and they let them assume. It kept things simple. Safe, but safety had a way of crumbling under pressure. Later that night, as Elena tucked Sophie into bed, brushing curls from her daughter's forehead, the fear returned. What if Julian remembered? What if he found out? What if he found out? What if everything she'd built came crashing down again? She whispered a promise against Sophie's cheek. "We're gonna be okay, baby. I'll keep you safe." But as she stepped out of the room and closed the door behind her, she could feel the walls tightening. The past was waking up, and it was starting to breathe down her neck. The fever came without warning. Elena had worked 3 nights in a row and nearly missed it. Sophie was quieter than usual, curling up on the couch with her favorite blanket and refusing her bedtime snack. When Elena touched her forehead, it was burning. By morning, the bruises had multiplied. Faint patches on her legs and arms, like shadows of something more sinister. Elena's stomach twisted as she lifted Sophie's sleeve and found one near her shoulder that hadn't been there the day before. She didn't wait. After her shift ended, she rushed Sophie into the pediatric ward, heart pounding like a war drum. The doctor was kind but clinical. His tone clipped as he rattled off tests and possibilities that made her ears ring. Elena sat on the exam room bench, holding Sophie close as nurses drew blood and took vitals. Sophie didn't cry. She was brave, her wide brown eyes looking up at her mother like she understood something deeper was wrong. When the diagnosis came, it hit Elena like a freight train. Hemophagocytic lymphocytic lymphohistiocytosis, a rare and aggressive immune condition. The words blurred together in her mind, medical jargon she'd heard before, but never this close to home. The doctor explained the treatment. Immunosuppressants, hospital stays, a possible bone marrow transplant. Her voice cracked when she asked about a donor. The answer was quiet and devastating. She didn't have another child, no siblings, no matches in the system yet. Time was not on her side. Elena left the room with numb legs and a hollow heart. Sophie had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Her daughter, her bright, brave girl, was sick with something she couldn't fix on her own. She'd faced down years of debt, judgment, and silence. But this was bigger, more terrifying. The fear coiled inside her, paralyzing and sharp. At the same time, Julian noticed her absence. He hadn't meant to care, but over the past few days, he'd found himself watching for her in the hallways, expecting to catch a glimpse of her soft features behind those thick glasses. When she wasn't at the project meeting, he asked about her. No one knew where she was. Just that she'd clocked out early and looked pale, distracted. That evening, as he walked past the pediatric ward on his way to the West Wing, he caught sight of her. Through the glass. She sat on the edge of a hospital bed, holding a sleeping child in her arms. Her posture was stiff, protective, her hand stroking the girl's curls in slow, methodical movements. Her face was turned downward, her expression unreadable but raw. Julian slowed. Something about the way she held that child made his chest tighten. He stepped into the room quietly, not wanting to startle her, but Elena sensed him anyway. Just said softly, "She's sick." Julian's gaze fell to the little girl. She was small, fragile, and somehow, in that instant, deeply familiar. His throat went dry. Elena nodded, her voice hoarse. Her name's Sophie. Julian moved closer, careful not to make the moment heavier than it already was. She looks like you, he offered gently. Elena finally looked at him, eyes glassy. She's all I have. There was something in her voice that shook him more than he expected. Julian stood silently for a long moment before sitting in the nearby chair. Neither of them spoke. The machines beeped softly. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows in steady rhythm. In that quiet, grief-filled room, the years between them began to bend, folding inward like pages of a forgotten book. Sophie shifted in Elena's arms, her small fingers curling into her mother's shirt. Julian watched them, his thoughts spinning. Something was clicking into place. The child's face, her eyes. There was a resemblance that wouldn't let him go. Later that night, unable to sleep, Julian reached out to an old contact at a private lab. Quiet, discreet. He requested something he wasn't sure he had the right to ask for. Not a comparison, just to put his mind at ease. The results would take a few days. But something inside him already knew. He just couldn't explain how or why. Only that the girl in that bed had eyes like his. And Elena Moore wasn't just any nurse. Not to him. Not anymore. The hospital buzzed with a quiet urgency the following week, the kind that lingers beneath the surface when people know something is wrong, but don't have the words to name it. Elena buried herself in work, taking extra shifts, covering for tired nurses, and slipping between rooms like a ghost. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want anyone to ask about Sophie. Her daughter had been admitted for close observation, her tiny body connected to machines that beeped and blinked as if measuring Elena's anxiety in real time. Every time Elena passed the glass wall of Sophie's room, her heart clenched, but she didn't go in unless she had to. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Julian noticed. He'd always been good at reading people. You didn't build a medical empire without learning to read silences just as well as you read voices. Elena's silence had grown deeper. More fragile. She moved like a woman balancing a storm on her shoulders, and Julian found himself watching her more than he should. He called her in for a meeting. At first, she didn't show. Then, an hour later, she appeared at his office door, eyes rimmed with fatigue, her badge slightly crooked. She stepped inside without speaking, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I want you to work on the pediatric data integration with me," Julian said, offering her a folder without fanfare. She blinked, caught off guard. "Why me?" "You're good at what you do," he replied simply, leaning back in his chair. "And you care. That matters." Elena hesitated, then reached for the folder. Their fingers brushed. It was the briefest touch, but it sent a tremor through her spine. She pulled away too fast, clutching the papers like a shield. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave, but Julian spoke again. "Elena." She paused. "Have we met before?" The question hit her like a glass of ice water. Her grip on the folder tightened. "No," she said, too quickly, too sharply. Julian watched her go, something unsettled, curling in his chest. That night, Elena sat by Sophie's bedside, her daughter asleep under a soft fleece blanket patterned with stars. The machines glowed in the dark room, steady and calm. Elena leaned her head back against the chair and let her eyes close. Just for a moment. The last few days had carved something hollow in her, something deep and aching. Her daughter needed a donor. The wait list was long. The guilt crept in like fog. If she had told Julian the truth from the start. But no, she couldn't think like that. The past wasn't something you could just reopen and hope it didn't hurt. She pressed a kiss to Sophie's forehead and stepped out into the hallway. Her body led her to the on-call room, not because she planned to sleep, but because it was one of the few places no one would ask her anything. Julian was already there. He looked up from the notes in his lap, startled, then offered her a faint smile. Didn't expect anyone else here. "I can leave," she murmured, already turning. "No," he said, sitting up straighter. "Stay." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped inside and sat on the bench across from him. Neither of them spoke. Time stretched long and quiet between them. Finally, Julian exhaled, his voice low. "I'm not good at this. Talking. I never was." Elena's lips curved into the smallest smile. "You used to be." That caught him. He turned to face her fully. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavy in the air. Julian looked at her, really looked at her. In the quiet light of the call room, something shifted. The walls they had both built, out of fear, out of necessity, wavered. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was proximity. But when their eyes met, something pulled them closer. She didn't mean to lean in. He didn't mean to meet her halfway. But when their lips touched, it felt like falling into a memory they'd both forgotten how to hold. The kiss was soft, tentative, and laced with years of silence. A spark reignited, fragile but real. And in that moment, surrounded by beeping monitors and cold tile walls, they surrendered. Not to lust, not to impulse, but to the echo of a connection that had never truly died. Elena sat on the edge of her bathtub, the small plastic test trembling in her hands. The bathroom light flickered overhead, buzzing faintly like it could sense the tension clinging to the air. Her eyes were locked on the faint pink lines that had appeared just seconds ago, yet had already changed everything. Pregnant. Again. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her breath catching. It hadn't been planned. It hadn't even crossed her mind. That night in the call room, she just needed to feel something other than fear, other than helplessness. Julian had been warmth in the middle of winter, a flicker of light in a life overwhelmed by cold. But now, this, a sibling, could save Sophie. The doctor had said it like it was a lottery ticket, a desperate hope wrapped in science. Cord blood from a sibling might offer a real chance. That made her decision for her. The panic didn't leave, but it settled into a tight ball of resolve. She would keep the baby. She would protect this life for Sophie's sake. For all their sakes. But she wouldn't tell Julian. Not yet. Down the hall, Sophie slept soundly, her tiny body finally resting after a long day of treatments. Elena watched her through the doorway for a moment, the glow of the nightlight softening her daughter's features. There was so much of Julian in her, the shape of her jaw, the way her eyes flicked open when she heard even the quietest sound. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat and closed the bathroom door behind her. This secret, like so many others, would be hers to carry. Unbeknownst to Elena, she wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Claire Vaughn had returned to Portland just 2 days ago, stepping into Julian's life with a bright smile and perfectly manicured charm. She'd noticed the change in him almost immediately. The way his eyes wandered, the slight distraction in his voice, the longer hours at the hospital. And then there was the nurse, the one with the quiet presence and the guarded eyes. Elena Moore. Claire remembered her name now. She'd seen it once in a report left out on Julian's desk. At the time, it hadn't meant much. But now she was sure something was going on. She had someone tail Elena. A man who owed her favors and didn't ask too many questions. In less than a week, he reported back with photos of Elena at the pharmacy, picking up prenatal vitamins, holding her stomach with unconscious protectiveness. Claire's stomach twisted, not with sadness, but fury. How dare this woman worm her way back into Julian's life? And now she was pregnant. Claire had been patient for 2 years. She hadn't worn his ring for fun. She wanted this woman gone. So she found someone else. A nurse on Elena's floor, deep in debt and desperate enough to say yes. Claire handed her a small envelope. Inside was a capsule crushed into fine powder. Just enough. Nothing too obvious. Slip it into her water, let nature take its course. The nurse hesitated. Claire leaned in, her voice a whisper wrapped in poison. You do this, and your debt disappears. Hours later, Elena was halfway through her shift, moving on autopilot. The world felt heavy, like everything was pressing in from all sides. She grabbed a water bottle from the break room fridge, not thinking twice. The nurse had smiled at her. Too sweet, too practiced. 15 minutes later, Elena collapsed. She barely remembered it. Just the searing pain, the sudden rush of heat in her lower abdomen, and then the panic in the eyes of the nearest nurse. Blood soaked through her scrubs as her knees hit the floor. People shouted. Hands reached for her. She felt herself being lifted, rolled onto a gurney. Her vision blurred. She woke to white lights and a doctor's grim expression. I'm so sorry, he said gently. You lost the baby. The words carved into her like a blade. Elena turned her head away, refusing to let the tears fall. But they came anyway. Silent. But they came anyway. Down the hall, Sophie stirred in her bed, unaware that the sibling who might have saved her was already gone. And in a corner of the hospital, Claire smiled over a glass of wine, believing she had won. But storms never stayed silent for long. Elena's scream echoed down the hallway, a raw, guttural sound that pierced the sterile air of the ear and silenced everything in its path. Nurses stopped mid-step. Doctors glanced up from charts. The world seemed to pause as her grief filled the space like smoke, thick and choking. She lay on the hospital bed, clutching the thin blanket over her abdomen, tears streaming down her cheeks, her body racked with sobs. She had lost more than a pregnancy. She had lost hope again. The fragile thread she dared to grasp for Sophie's sake had been torn from her hands before it had even begun. Julian stood outside the observation room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd heard the scream from 2 corridors away. It took everything in him not to rush in, but the attending physician had asked for space. So he waited, eyes locked on the window, jaw tight, heart racing with something he couldn't name. Grief, guilt. He didn't even know what had happened yet. Only that it had broken her. That night, he barely slept. His mind wouldn't stop. Something about Elena's collapse didn't sit right. She'd been fine just hours earlier. Tired, yes, but healthy. Her vitals had plummeted in minutes. The symptoms didn't align. And when he reviewed her chart, something leaped out at him. The bottle of water she drank before her shift. A new nurse had signed off on handing it to her. One Julian had never seen before. By morning, he ordered a quiet internal review. Nothing official, not yet. Just enough to dig into the chain of access and see if there were inconsistencies. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a medical accident. It was something else, something darker. But before the results could come back, tragedy struck again. Margot West collapsed in his office the following afternoon. Just minutes after demanding to see him, she had arrived unannounced, her heels clicking against the tile, her voice as sharp and cold as ever. "You're distracted, Julian," she had said. "We didn't build this legacy for you to ruin it chasing ghosts. Julian had barely responded before she grabbed her chest and crumpled to the floor. Paramedics rushed her down the hall. Julian ran beside the stretcher, barking orders, but it was too late. Her heart gave out before she reached the trauma unit. A toxicology screen later revealed something unthinkable. Her medication had been tampered with. The vial in her handbag contained counterfeit pills, similar in appearance, but chemically deadly. The hospital erupted in chaos. Security footage was pulled. Witnesses were interviewed. And then someone found a second vial. This one in a staff locker room trash bin. Julian was called to the scene. A nurse handed him the evidence in a Ziploc bag. On it were faint, smudged fingerprints. Elena's. Julian stared at the vial, his blood running cold. It didn't make sense. Not Elena. Not the woman who sat beside her daughter every night, whispering stories to keep the fear away. Not the woman whose strength had drawn him in like a tide. But the fingerprints didn't lie, and neither did the mounting questions. He didn't know what to believe. Later that night, he called Mason. He didn't want to, but something in him needed clarity, and Mason had always been close to Elena. "I need to see her," Julian said, voice low, frayed, alone. "She won't come if I ask, but she'll listen to you." Mason hesitated, then agreed. He drove Elena out to a house on the outskirts of the city, telling her it was just a quick errand, a favor for a friend. She was pale, fragile, and barely speaking. When she stepped into the warm wood, paneled living room, Julian was already there, standing with the vial in his hand. "Did you do this?" he asked, voice taut with grief. Her eyes widened.
"What? No, Julian, I swear."
He held up a hand, his expression torn. "I don't want to believe it. But I don't know what's real anymore." She took a step back, suddenly terrified. "You think I'd kill your mother?" He didn't answer. Instead, he locked the front door, not to trap her, but to keep her safe, to buy time. But all she saw was betrayal. Elena pounded on the door, panic rising, her voice cracking as she yelled for Mason, for help, for air. Her world was crumbling around her, and the man she once loved had just become another stranger with power she couldn't trust. Outside, storm cloud gathered over Portland, heavy and dark. Inside, trust shattered quietly. The message came through as a voicemail, gravel, rough and laced with venom. The voice belonged to a man Elena hadn't heard in years, but one she could never forget. "We've got your kid," he growled. 10 million from your CO friend, or she's gone. Don't get smart, Elena." A pause, then a click. The call ended. Maddie's soft cry echoed faintly in the background of the recording. But Elena didn't hear it. Her phone had died hours earlier, its battery drained while she sat locked inside the lake house with Julian, too stunned by his accusations to realize time was slipping away. While she shouted and pounded on the door, Mason had returned to the hospital, only to discover the unimaginable. Sophie was missing. Panic didn't come in waves. It came in a freefall. Mason raced back to the house, his tires screeching as he pulled into the gravel drive. Rain was coming down hard, turning the windshield into a blur of lights and shadows. He didn't knock. He threw the door open and stormed inside, soaked and breathless. "They took her," he shouted, eyes wild. "Walter and Lacey. They took Sophie." Julian turned, stunned. "They left a message," Mason continued, pulling out his phone. "They want money. 10 million. Or she's gone." Elena froze. The blood drained from her face. She stumbled back against the wall, her breath catching in her chest like she was drowning on dry land. Julian stepped toward her, his voice soft but urgent. "We'll get her back. I promise." Elena rounded on him, eyes blazing.
Don't make promises you're not sure you can keep.
Julian didn't flinch. He pulled out his phone, dialing a private number. His security team, a specialized group used to handling boardroom threats and political blackmail, picked up instantly. "I need a trace on a burner call. Sent to a nurse named Elena Moore. Just now. Kidnapping threat. Get me a location." He hung up and turned back to her. "We're going after her." They didn't wait. There was no time to second guess. Mason threw them the keys, and Julian drove. Fast. Focused. Rain hammered the windshield as the wipers fought to keep up. The tires slid at turns, hydroplaning for a second that felt like forever. But Julian didn't slow down. Elena sat in the passenger seat, fists clenched, lips trembling. Her thoughts were spiraling. She could see Sophie's face so clearly, her sleepy smile, the way she curled her toes when she was nervous, the quiet bravery she wore like armor. And now, she was out there, scared and alone, in the hands of people who had never cared about her. Not really. Not ever. Walter Sullivan had always been a monster hiding in plain sight. A man who walked away from his daughter when she was just a child, and only re-emerged when there was something to gain. Lacey was worse, a shadow clinging to his ambition, her greed dressed up in designer knockoffs and empty apologies. The signal came in 15 minutes later. An abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. Industrial Park. No guards. No guards. No guards, just isolation and darkness. Julian pulled the car to a stop a block away. His team was already in position. Flashlights cut through the night, beams of white slicing through the rain. He looked at Elena. "Stay behind me." She didn't respond. She just got out of the car. Inside the warehouse, Sophie sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest. Her small body shivered in the cold. Walter paced in the corner, muttering under his breath, while Lacey scrolled on her phone, bored.
She better be worth this, Lacey said, her voice sharp.
"She is," Walter snapped. "She's our ticket out." That ticket came crashing through the door moments later. Julian's team moved fast. One guard tackled Walter as he lunged with a rusted pipe. Another restrained Lacey before she could scream. Elena burst in, slipping on the wet floor, eyes locked on the tiny form in the corner. "Sophie!" The girl looked up and ran, stumbling into her mother's arms. Elena dropped to her knees, holding her so tightly it hurt. She buried her face in Sophie's hair and sobbed. Julian watched, frozen in place. For a moment, all he could see was the family he hadn't known was his. Two people he was bound to by blood and fate. He moved closer, kneeling beside them. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, voice cracking. Elena looked up, eyes still full of pain. She didn't speak. She just nodded, holding her daughter like the world had tried to steal her and failed. And in that warehouse, beneath flickering lights and the smell of rust, the storm inside them all finally began to break. Back at the hospital, Sophie was rushed into emergency care, her body cold and weak but miraculously intact. The doctor's words were cautious but encouraging. "She's stable. We'll monitor her closely." Elena sat at her daughter's bedside, brushing a damp curl from her forehead, whispering over and over, "You're safe now, baby. Mommy's here." Relief had settled somewhere between her ribs like a weight, not fully gone, but no longer suffocating. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Her eyes stayed on Sophie's face, memorizing every breath, every flutter of her lashes, terrified to look away. Julian stood in the hallway outside, his fists clenched in his coat pockets. His team had already handed Walter and Lacey over to authorities. The fallout had begun, press inquiries swirling, the board growing nervous, his name teetering on the edge of scandal. But none of it mattered more than the question that still burned in his chest, the one he hadn't dared to ask when they found Sophie in that warehouse. Now, he couldn't hold it in any longer. He stepped into the room, quiet but sure. Elena didn't look up until he was beside her. She seemed smaller somehow, hollowed by the chaos, and yet still rooted like a tree battered by storms. "Is she?" His voice caught. "Is Sophie mine?" The words dropped like stones between them. Elena didn't answer right away. Her hand froze in Sophie's hair. Her breath hitched. Then Mason's voice came from the doorway behind them, low and firm. "Yes, she's yours." Julian turned, eyes narrowing. "You knew?" "I've known since the beginning," Mason said. "But it wasn't my truth to tell." Julian looked back at Elena. "You didn't tell me." Her shoulders tensed. "I couldn't," she said softly. "Your mother paid me to disappear, Julian. And when I found out I was pregnant, I was already gone. I didn't know what she'd do if she found out about Sophie." He staggered back a step like her words physically struck him. "She kept this from me, and I funded her care. I've been Mr. Orion this whole time. I just didn't know it's for you. For Sophie." "You were the one helping me," Elena whispered, stunned. He nodded slowly. "My legal team set it up years ago to give anonymous aid to struggling patients. I never saw your name. I never knew it was you." Elena stared at him, the truth unraveling like a knot. The man she'd feared, the man she'd hidden from, had been the one quietly saving her. Saving Sophie. "I wanted to protect her," she said, "even from you, especially from your family." Julian's voice broke. "You should have told me. I would fought for her. For both of you. I didn't think you'd choose us over them." There it was, the wound, laid bare. Julian crossed to the bed, kneeling beside Sophie, who stirred slightly in her sleep. He reached out, brushing a knuckle gently across her cheek. "She looks like you," he said, voice trembling. "But those eyes, they're mine." Elena's eyes welled. She's always asked about her dad. I told her. He was someone kind. Someone far away. "I'm not going anywhere now," Julian said, looking up at her. "You don't have to run anymore." Silence stretched, thick with everything they'd lost and everything they might still gain. Outside the room, Mason stepped back, giving them space. Inside, Elena exhaled slowly, tears spilling quietly down her cheeks. The truth had been a cage for so long. But now that it was out, she could finally breathe. Julian took her hand, tentative at first, and this time she didn't pull away. They stayed like that, watching over their daughter, hearts heavy but no longer hidden. For the first time in 6 years, they were no longer strangers. They were a family, fractured, fragile, but real. The morning after Sophie's rescue, the hospital woke to a different kind of tension. Rumors had already started to circulate about a kidnapping, about a secret child, about the new CO who hadn't left the pediatric wing all night. Julian sat beside Sophie's bed as the little girl finally began to stir, blinking up at the strange man holding her hand. Her voice, small and groggy, cut through the stillness. "Are you my daddy?" Julian's breath caught. He glanced at Elena, who sat on the opposite side of the bed, frozen. Then he turned back to Sophie, his voice breaking slightly as he said, "Yeah, sweetheart. I am." Sophie smiled, sleepy and sweet, and curled her fingers tighter around his. Outside the room, The rest of the world was beginning to unravel. Claire Vaughn had been keeping close watch ever since the night Elena collapsed. She had watched Julian become more distant, more fixated, more human, and now all her worst suspicions had been confirmed. The child, the woman, the shift in Julian's gaze. She hadn't meant for things to spiral like this. Not exactly. But now, the threads were snapping, and she was clinging to the last shred of control she had. Unfortunately for her, control was slipping fast. Julian's legal team, following the trail of the counterfeit medication that had killed Margot West, had uncovered evidence that pointed directly back to Claire. The nurse she'd paid to tamper with Elena's drink had cracked under pressure, confessing everything. How she'd been handed money in cash, how she'd been told to make it look like a miscarriage. Nothing traceable, but she hadn't covered her tracks well. Surveillance footage, bank transfers. They all painted a picture, and Julian had all the pieces. He confronted Claire at her penthouse that evening. She opened the door in silk and pearls, feigning surprise as he stepped inside. She said with a false softness,
You should have.
He didn't waste time. He held out the manila folder, thick with printed evidence. You drugged her? Her face didn't falter. I have no idea what you're talking about. You killed my child, he said, his voice sharp as glass. And you killed my mother. That made her blink. Julian, I never meant for... He cut her off. Save it. There's a warrant for your arrest. They're coming. I thought you loved me, Claire. But all you ever wanted was the name. The legacy. Claire's facade shattered, just for a moment. I wanted a life with you. I was protecting us. You were protecting yourself, he said coldly. By the time the police arrived, Claire's hands were shaking. Her arrest made headlines the next morning. Charges of attempted murder, manslaughter, conspiracy. Her world collapsed in hours. Her family distanced themselves. Her business deals fell through. Her social circle vanished. Her name, once whispered with admiration, became synonymous with scandal. Julian didn't attend the arraignment. He stayed with Elena and Sophie instead. But there were still more shadows to deal with. Walter and Lacey, already in custody for the kidnapping, were facing additional charges after Julian's team dug deeper. An anonymous tip led investigators to a storage unit Walter had been renting under an alias. Inside were boxes of counterfeit medications, including the same kind Margot had been taking. The connection was undeniable. The charges expanded. Fraud, drug trafficking, involuntary manslaughter. Walter tried to bargain, throwing Lacey under the bus. But it was too late. Julian held a press conference on the steps of Silver Lake Medical Center. He stood at the podium in a dark suit, the hospital's logo gleaming behind him. Walter Sullivan endangered lives for profit, he said to the sea of microphones and cameras. Including my mother's. He will answer for that. Inside the hospital, Elena watched the live feed from the staff lounge. The nurses, who once whispered behind her back, now watched in silence, some of them with tears in their eyes. She wasn't just the quiet nurse anymore. She was the woman who had faced down tragedy and survived it. Later that night, Julian returned to her, exhausted but resolute. He found her in Sophie's room, asleep in the chair beside the bed. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She stirred, then looked at him with guarded eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. She took a breath, eyes glistening. "Your mother gave me $1 million to leave you. She said I'd ruin you. And when I found out I was pregnant, I couldn't risk her taking Sophie. I couldn't risk her taking Sophie. I couldn't." Julian's throat tightened. "I should have fought harder. I should have found you." "You didn't know," she whispered. He reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. "I do now," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." Days passed, and the hospital slowly settled into its familiar rhythm. But for Elena, the air felt lighter, not weightless. Scars didn't vanish that easily, but no longer suffocating. Sophie remained under close observation, her vitals steady, her energy slowly returning. She laughed again, asked for her favorite story again, even asked Julian if he knew how to braid hair. He didn't, but he tried, fumbling with the elastic, while Elena watched from the doorway, heart caught between awe and tenderness. Julian had kept his promise. He stayed. Every morning, he brought coffee for Elena, not saying much, just setting it down beside her and quietly slipping into Sophie's world like he had always belonged. There was no grand apology, no sweeping declarations, just presence. Consistent, comforting, and entirely unexpected. But healing wasn't just about showing up. It was about rebuilding what had been torn down, and Julian seemed to know that. He took a step back from Caldwell West Holdings, delegating tasks, turning down travel obligations, and focusing instead on something closer to his heart. He'd begun drafting plans for a foundation in Sophie's name, an initiative to fund research and care for children with rare illnesses like hers. He called it Sophie's Light. Elena wasn't sure when she started smiling without catching herself. Maybe it was when Julian brought Sophie a stuffed bear that looked like a miniature doctor and called it Dr. Fluffy. Or maybe it was the way he knelt beside Sophie's bed and let her stick stickers on his tie like it was the most important thing in the world. Somewhere in those quiet, ordinary moments, something shifted. Trust began to grow again, shy and unsteady, but real. Meanwhile, Mason kept checking in, though his role had subtly shifted. He no longer hovered protectively like he had in the past, instead becoming the steady friend who reminded Elena to eat, to rest, to breathe. He even laughed when Sophie told a nurse that her first daddy was actually a guitar player who couldn't cook but made the best monster voices during story time. Mason just winked and said, "Retired now, kiddo." But the real miracle came from somewhere none of them expected. One evening, while Elena sat in the hospital garden with Sophie wrapped in a blanket beside her, Mason rushed in, waving a file like a madman. "I found one," he panted, "a match." Elena stood so fast the blanket fell to the ground. "What?" "A donor. Boston. 26-year-old woman who signed up for a marrow registry during college. She's a match. A good one." Tears sprang to Elena's eyes before she could stop them. She hugged Mason without a word and scooped Sophie into her arms and spun her, careful not to jostle her too much. "You hear that, baby? You're going to be okay." The transplant happened 2 weeks later. It was tense, precise, and delicate. Julian stayed in the waiting room the entire time, pacing the floor in silent prayer. Elena sat curled in a chair, her head against his shoulder. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The room was filled with quiet hope. When the doctor finally stepped in, pulling down his surgical mask with a tired but genuine smile, the words they had waited months to hear finally came. "She's going to be okay." Elena collapsed into Julian's arms, sobbing freely, years of fear and pain spilling out all at once. He held her like he'd never let go. Sophie's recovery was slow but steady. She grew stronger each day, her laughter returning with the spring sunshine. And just like that, a new chapter began. Julian's foundation launched a month later in a brightly lit atrium filled with donors, families, and staff. He stood on stage with Sophie on his hip, Elena at his side. Cameras flashed, but his voice remained calm. "This is for her," he said, "and for every child still waiting for their miracle." The donations poured in. Millions pledged in hours. Mason played a song he'd written just for Sophie, his guitar filling the space with warmth and memory. Later that night, back in the quiet of their home, Elena stood in the nursery, rocking gently as she looked out at the blooming garden Julian had planted for her. It was full of color now. Daffodils, tulips, a few stubborn sunflowers. Life, everywhere. Julian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned into him, her smile soft. "They said she wouldn't make it," she whispered. "But she did," he said, "and so did we." And for the first time in a very long time, Elena believed it. The house on the edge of Portland had once been meant for someone else, a quiet retreat Julian purchased under the anonymous name of Mr. Orion, a sanctuary he'd imagined for a struggling mother he'd never expected to meet. Now it belonged to them. The living room windows opened to a view of gentle hills and tall fir trees. Birds sang in the early morning, and the wind carried the soft scent of rain and earth. It wasn't grand, but it was safe. It was home. Elena stood barefoot in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug of tea, watching Sophie play in the backyard. The little girl was barefoot too, dancing between puddles in her rainbow pajamas, giggling as sunlight broke through the clouds. Her cheeks were full of color again, her hair pulled into crooked pigtails. Strength was coming back to her slowly, but surely. Her laugh didn't sound like a miracle anymore. It just sounded like Sophie. Julian walked in, still in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He leaned against the doorway, his gaze on both of them. "She's making up for lost time." "She's alive," Elena said, smiling into her cup. "That's all that matters." He crossed the kitchen, pressed a kiss to her temple, then looked at her with a grin that never quite lost its awe. "You're the strongest person I know." Elena shook her head. "I just kept going." That's what strength looks like. In the following weeks, life unfolded in beautiful, ordinary ways. Elena returned to work, slowly easing back into her shifts at Silver Lake. There were still stares and whispers, of course, but they had shifted, from gossip to respect. The staff had watched her fight for her daughter, stand up against giants, and survive. No one questioned her strength now, and Julian, who had once loomed large as a distant, untouchable CEO, was now simply the man who sat in the hospital cafeteria, coloring with his daughter, or helping nurses restock the supply cart. He had become part of the rhythm. Their relationship wasn't perfect. It was real. There were quiet arguments about work hours, long talks about trust, moments of doubt they didn't shy away from. But beneath it, all was something stronger than before. Not the rushed, young love of their 20s, but something grown from scars and second chances. Something that could last. Then one evening, as spring melted into summer and the world turned golden, Elena felt it. A flutter. She stood in the bathroom again, holding her breath, staring down at a familiar plastic test. This time, the two lines came quickly, bold, certain. When she told Julian over dinner, Sophie already asleep upstairs, her voice trembled. He looked up from his plate, stunned. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then his face cracked into the kind of smile that could light up the whole room. He reached for her hand across the table. "This time," he said softly, "we'll do it all together." The pregnancy was smooth. The fear from last time never truly left. But it no longer ruled her. Julian came to every appointment, asked too many questions, kept every ultrasound photo in his wallet. Sophie called the baby Jellybean and left drawings on the fridge for her future sibling. The day they brought Owen home, a boy with Julian's dark eyes and Elena's soft mouth. Sophie sat beside the crib like a knight on duty. She whispered, "You're safe now," like a promise only she could make. Julian sold his penthouse and moved into the house full-time. He stopped traveling, delegated more, spent his mornings making pancakes and teaching Sophie how to ride a bike. Evenings were filled with bedtime stories, baby bottles, and mismatched socks. It was chaos. It was love. They built something whole out of what had once been broken. Elena's mother, now recovered and living with them, knitted blankets and told stories in Spanish. Mason visited often, strumming lullabies on his guitar, telling Owen he'd teach him the chords someday. No one talked about Walter or Lacey anymore. Their names became echoes of a life left behind. Sophie's light continued to grow, helping hundreds of families across the country. At the annual fundraiser, Julian stood on stage, Elena and the children beside him. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. But later, as they sat on the porch wrapped in quilts, watching fireflies dance beneath a starry sky, Julian turned to Elena and said, This is the real legacy." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We made it." And this time, they truly had. Life isn't about perfection. It's about resilience. Elena's journey reminds us that even in our darkest hours, when betrayal, heartbreak, and fear threaten to destroy everything, we can still rise. Her story is about the quiet strength it takes to survive when no one's watching, the courage to love again after being broken, and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. Julian's transformation teaches us that redemption is possible, but it requires more than words. It demands action, humility, and the willingness to face our mistakes head on. Trust, once shattered, doesn't rebuild overnight, but when nurtured with honesty and care, it can grow into something stronger than before. Most importantly, this story is about family. Not just the one we're born into, but the one we fight to protect, the one we choose, and the one that chooses us back. Through the storms, the betrayals, and the second chances, what matters most is love. Unshakable, quiet, enduring love. So wherever you are in your journey, remember this. You are stronger than your past, braver than your fears, and more loved than you know. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful beginnings. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply reminded you of the power of hope, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that touches the heart. We're just getting started.